Imagine standing on the dusty streets of San Antonio de Bexar in the autumn of 1835. The air hangs thick with tension, like the oppressive heat before a Texas thunderstorm. Mexican soldiers patrol the plaza in their blue wool uniforms, muskets slung over their shoulders, eyeing the Anglo-American settlers with suspicion. Those settlers, rough-hewn farmers and frontiersmen who call themselves Texians, stare back with equal wariness, their hands never far from their long rifles. This is Texas on the edge of revolution, a powder keg waiting for a spark. But how did it come to this? How did neighbors become enemies? How did a distant province of Mexico transform into a battleground that would change the map of North America forever? To understand the battles that shook Texas in 1835 and 1836, we must first understand the collision of two very different worlds. Our story begins not with gunfire, but with an invitation. In 1824, the newly independent nation of Mexico faced a daunting problem. Its vast northern frontier, the region we now call Texas, was a dangerous wilderness. Comanche warriors, perhaps the finest light cavalry the world had ever seen, raided settlements with impunity. The land was rich and fertile, but few Mexican citizens wanted to risk their lives to settle it. So Mexico opened its doors. Through the empresario system, the government invited American families to settle in Texas. In exchange for cheap land, acres upon acres of black soil prairie and timber, these settlers would become Mexican citizens, convert to Catholicism, at least on paper, and serve as a buffer against Comanche raids and potential American expansion. It seemed like a brilliant solution. For a while, it was. The settlers flooded in, families from Tennessee, Kentucky, Alabama, and beyond, pulling their possessions in creaking wagons, driving their cattle and hogs before them. They were farmers seeking opportunity, adventurers seeking fortune, and sometimes fugitives seeking a fresh start. They brought with them their slaves, their Protestant Bibles, and their democratic ideals learned from the American frontier. By 1830, something alarming had happened. Anglo-American settlers outnumbered Mexican Tejanos in Texas by a margin of 3-1. The Mexican government suddenly realized it hadn't created a buffer, it had invited a potential invasion. At the heart of the growing conflict lay a document, the Mexican Constitution of 1824. Like the United States Constitution, it was a federalist framework that gave significant power to individual states. Texas wasn't its own state. It was joined with Coahuila to form Coahuila y Tejas. But the Constitution promised local control, individual rights, and representative government. The Texians loved this Constitution. They had sworn oaths to it when they became Mexican citizens. It represented everything they believed in: liberty, self-governance, and limited central authority. But in Mexico City, a charismatic general named Antonio López de Santa Anna was rising to power. Elected president in 1833 as a liberal reformer, Santa Anna soon revealed himself to be something very different. A centralist who believed Mexico needed a strong hand to hold it together. State by state, he dissolved legislatures and stripped away the autonomy the Constitution of 1824 had promised. Picture Santa Anna in his ornate military uniform, medals gleaming on his chest, pacing the halls of the National Palace. He saw himself as Mexico's savior, the man who would forge a unified nation from the chaos of independence. To him, the colonists in Texas were ungrateful immigrants who refused to follow Mexican law, smuggled goods to avoid customs duties, and clung stubbornly to their Protestant faith and their slaves, both illegal under Mexican law. From the adobe houses and rough timber cabins of Texas, the settlers saw something entirely different. They saw a tyrant who had betrayed the Constitution they'd sworn to uphold. They saw a distant government that demanded taxes but provided no protection, no courts, no infrastructure. They saw soldiers arriving to enforce laws they had never agreed to follow. In 1830, the Mexican government passed the Law of April 6th, slamming shut the door they had opened just years before. No more American immigration, new customs duties on goods, new military garrisons to enforce Mexican authority. The mood in Texas darkened. Resentment simmered in every settlement, from Nacogdoches in the pine forests of East Texas to San Antonio on the edge of Comancheria. Men gathered in taverns and spoke in low voices about their rights, about tyranny, about what free men would or would not tolerate. By 1835, rebellion was spreading across Mexico like wildfire. In the state of Zacatecas, citizens rose up against Santa Anna's centralist policies and were crushed. In the Yucatan, another rebellion flickered to life. These weren't foreign invaders. These were Mexican citizens fighting for the federalist system they believed in. The Texians, at least at first, saw themselves as part of this broader struggle. They weren't fighting against Mexico. They were fighting for the Mexico they had been promised, the Mexico of the Constitution of 1824. They raised the Mexican tricolor flag with 1824 emblazoned across it. They called themselves Federalists, not revolutionaries. But Santa Anna had other names for them: pirates, criminals, rebels who would be shown no mercy. By September 1835, Texas balanced on the edge of a knife. Every confrontation, every harsh word, every weapon cleaned and loaded brought the province closer to war. Neither side fully understood what was about to be unleashed. In the small settlement of Gonzales, east of San Antonio, a bronze cannon sat buried in a peach orchard. It was a small thing, barely more than a toy by military standards. A 6-pounder loaned years ago for defense against Comanche raids. But when a Mexican officer arrived to reclaim it, the citizens of Gonzales made a decision that would echo across history. They would not give it back. That single act of defiance, that one moment of stubborn courage, would light the fuse. Within weeks, the frontier would run red with blood. Men would die by the hundreds. Ancient missions would become fortresses. A general in a fancy uniform would meet defeat at the hands of ragtag settlers, shouting words that would become legend. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad. But first came Gonzales. First came a homemade flag with a star, a cannon, and 4 words that captured the spirit of Texas defiance: "Come and take it." The war was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The trouble started with a cannon, or rather, the principle behind it. In the scorching heat of September 1835, a lone Mexican corporal named Casimiro de Leon rode into Gonzales with 5 soldiers trailing behind him. His orders were simple: retrieve the small bronze cannon that had been loaned to the settlement years ago for protection against Comanche raids. It seemed like a routine matter. After all, it was Mexican government property. But nothing about Texas in 1835 was routine anymore. When Corporal de Leon presented his demand, the citizens of Gonzales didn't comply. Instead, they detained the surprised soldiers and spirited the cannon away to a peach orchard owned by George W. Davis, a settler who had farmed this land with his own sweat and blood. Under the cover of darkness, several men dug a hole among the peach trees and buried the 6-pounder like buried treasure, wrapping it carefully to protect it from the damp earth. The message was clear: we will not be disarmed. Back in San Antonio, Colonel Domingo de Ugartechea received word of this defiance with growing alarm. The settlers weren't just refusing an order, they were detaining soldiers and hiding government property. This was open rebellion. He made a decision that would change history. He would send a real military force to enforce Mexican authority. On September 29th, Lieutenant Francisco de Castañeda rode out of San Antonio at the head of 100 dragoons, professional cavalry soldiers in their blue uniforms and brass helmets, sabers hanging at their sides. Their horses' hooves kicked up clouds of dust as they moved east toward Gonzales. Castañeda was a career soldier, trained in military tactics and bound by honor to follow orders. But he was also a Federalist at heart, sympathetic to the colonists' complaints about Santa Anna's centralist government. His orders reflected this delicate balance: retrieve the cannon, but avoid bloodshed if possible. Do not start a war. It was an impossible task. When Castañeda's force reached the Guadalupe River on September 29th, they found their path blocked by something unexpected: high water from recent rains and, more importantly, 18 determined men on the opposite bank. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and shopkeepers who had grabbed their rifles and rushed to defend their town. History would remember them as the Old 18, and their names would be etched into the story of Texas forever. Leading them was Albert Martin, a settler who had appointed himself captain of this ragtag guard. Martin was no military genius, but he understood something crucial. Time was on their side. Every hour they delayed Castañeda was another hour for reinforcements to arrive from nearby settlements. Picture the scene: the wide Guadalupe River flowing swift and brown between the two forces, the September sun beating down mercilessly. On the far bank, Castañeda's dragoons sat on their horses, professional and disciplined, waiting for orders. On the near bank, the 18 settlers crouched behind whatever cover they could find: trees, rocks, the riverbank itself, their long rifles loaded and ready. When Castañeda sent a messenger across to demand the cannon, Martin had his answer ready. The town's alcalde, Andrew Ponton, was out of town, he explained with a straight face. Nothing could be done until Ponton returned. It was impossible to make such an important decision without him. It was a lie, of course, a delaying tactic as transparent as glass, but it was also technically correct. Castañeda, bound by his orders to avoid creating an incident, had no choice but to wait. He withdrew his men 300 yards from the ford and made camp, his dragoons settling in with growing frustration as the hot afternoon stretched into evening. The Old 18 had won the first round without firing a shot. That night, as Castañeda's campfires flickered on the far bank, something extraordinary happened in Gonzales. Riders galloped out in every direction, to Fayette, to Columbus, to every settlement within a day's ride, carrying the news: Mexican soldiers were coming to take the cannon. Come help defend Gonzales. Come fight for your rights. And they came. By dozens, then by scores, settlers grabbed their rifles and powder horns, kissed their families goodbye, and rode for Gonzales. They came from farms where cotton grew in neat rows, from rough cabins in the oak forests, from settlements along every creek and river. By the morning of October 1st, the 18 defenders had swelled to nearly 140 men, a citizen army forming itself as if by magic, united by a shared sense that something important was happening here, something worth fighting for. Among them was Almiron Dickinson, a blacksmith with strong hands and a gift for working with artillery. He would play a crucial role in the coming hours, and months later, he would die defending the Alamo. Also present was John Sowell, a gunsmith whose skills would soon be put to the test. But the real transformation was happening in the homes and yards of Gonzales itself. The women of the settlement, wives, mothers, daughters, gathered with a purpose. They needed a flag, something to rally around, something to show the Mexican army that Gonzales would not back down. One woman offered up her wedding dress, a treasure in a frontier town where fine fabric was rare and precious. The women cut the white silk carefully, painting upon it a black star, an image of the cannon in profile, and 4 words that captured everything they felt in that moment: come and take it. It was defiance distilled into 4 words. It was a dare, a promise, and a declaration of war all at once. When the flag was raised over the town, every man who saw it understood. There would be no surrender, no backing down. They would fight. While the women sewed, the men worked on the cannon itself. George W. Davis led them back to his peach orchard, where they dug up the bronze 6-pounder like pirates retrieving buried treasure. The metal was damp, but undamaged, its bore still true. But how to mount it? They had no proper gun carriage, no military equipment at all. This is where frontier ingenuity came into play. The men found an old cotton wagon, the kind used to haul bales to market, and removed its rear wheels. John Sowell, the gunsmith, supervised as they mounted the cannon on the front axle, creating a crude but functional artillery piece. For ammunition, they had no proper cannonballs. Instead, they loaded the gun with whatever scrap metal they could find: broken chains, old horseshoes, bits of iron, anything that would fly when fired. It was improvised, makeshift, barely military at all, but it would have to do. On October 1st, Lieutenant Castaneda made his move. Frustrated by the standoff at the main ford, he marched his dragoons 7 miles upriver to the farm of Ezekiel Williams, one of the old 18. Perhaps he could cross there, approach the town from a different angle, catch the defenders off guard. But the Texians were watching. When scouts reported Castaneda's movement, the newly arrived commander John Henry Moore made a bold decision. They wouldn't wait for the Mexicans to attack. They would cross the river that very night and confront them at dawn. Under cover of darkness, the Texian force, now 140 strong, splashed across the Guadalupe River. The water was cold and swift, tugging at their legs as they waded through, holding their rifles and powder horns high to keep them dry. The improvised cannon came last, men straining against the ropes as they hauled it across on its cotton wagon wheels. They formed up on the far bank and marched through the darkness toward Williams' farm, where Castaneda's men lay sleeping around their campfires. The Texians moved quietly, their footsteps muffled by the soft prairie grass. They had surprise on their side, but they also had something else: weather. October 2nd, 1835, dawned gray and ghostly. A heavy fog had rolled in during the night, thick as cotton and just as white. It blanketed the prairie in eerie silence, reducing visibility to mere yards. You could barely see your hand in front of your face, let alone an enemy army. For the Mexican dragoons, waking to this impenetrable mist must have been unnerving. They knew the Texians were out there somewhere, but where? How many? What were they planning? For the Texians, the fog was a gift from heaven. It allowed them to move their cannon into position relatively close to the Mexican camp without being spotted. They could hear the Mexican soldiers talking nervously, the jingle of their equipment, the nervous whinnying of horses, but they remained invisible, ghosts in the mist. Then, as the first rays of sun began to burn away the fog's edges, the Texians opened fire. The boom of the 6-pounder shattered the morning silence. Scrap iron and chains blasted from the barrel in a spreading cloud, scattering the Mexican soldiers who were just forming their ranks. Horses reared and bolted, men dove for cover. The Texians cheered and reloaded, firing the cannon a second time. Between the artillery blasts, riflemen poured fire into the confused Mexican lines. The long rifles of the Texians, accurate to several hundred yards in the hands of experienced frontiersmen, outranged the Mexican muskets dramatically. But Castaneda was a professional. Despite the chaos, he rallied his men and returned fire, the Mexican muskets crackling in volleys. The fog swirled with gun smoke, creating an otherworldly battlefield where men fired at shadows and shapes, never quite sure what they were hitting. Then came a lull in the fighting. An eerie silence fell over the prairie as both sides caught their breath. What happened next reveals the strange, almost gentlemanly nature of this early phase of the war. John Henry Moore, the Texian commander, rode forward under a flag of truce. Castañeda met him in the no-man's land between the armies. Picture these two men facing each other in the thinning fog. Moore, rough and determined, a farmer turned soldier by necessity. Castañeda, professional and proud in his Mexican army uniform, a career officer caught between duty and conscience. Moore made his case with the passion of a true believer. This wasn't about Mexico, he explained. This was about the Constitution of 1824, the Federalist system that Santa Anna had betrayed. Join us, Moore urged. Fight for the Constitution you swore to defend, not for a dictator. Castañeda's response was the essence of military honor and personal tragedy. He admitted, there in the fog, with his men watching from a distance, that he agreed with the Texians. He was a Federalist. He despised what Santa Anna had done to Mexico's constitutional government. But he was also a soldier. I have my orders, Castañeda said, his voice heavy with the weight of duty. My honor as an officer requires me to obey them, even when my heart disagrees. I cannot join you. Moore must have respected that answer, even as it meant they would remain enemies. He nodded, turned his horse, and rode back to his lines. The guns spoke again. But Castañeda's heart wasn't in it anymore. His men were outnumbered and outgunned. The Texians had artillery and superior rifles. His orders had been to avoid a major confrontation, to retrieve the cannon without compromising the honor of Mexican arms. There was no honor to be won here, only blood to be spilled in a cause he didn't fully believe in. Castañeda gave the order to retreat. The dragoons mounted their horses and turned south, riding back toward San Antonio in a column that looked more like defeat than withdrawal. Behind them, the Texians cheered themselves hoarse, waving their come-and-take-it flag in triumph. The casualties were minimal, 1 or 2 Mexican soldiers killed in the chaos, and a Texian who took a rifle's recoil to the face and ended up with a bloody nose. By the standards of war, it was barely a skirmish. But by the standards of revolution, it was everything. The news of Gonzales spread across Texas like wildfire in dry grass. In every settlement, in every farm and ranch, men heard the same incredible story. Settlers had defied the Mexican army. They had fired on professional soldiers. They had forced them to retreat. And nothing terrible had happened. The sky hadn't fallen. Santa Anna's army hadn't magically appeared to crush them. Instead, they had won. The psychological impact was staggering. For years, the settlers had grumbled and complained, but ultimately submitted to Mexican authority because they assumed resistance was futile. Now they knew different. Now they knew they could fight. More importantly, they couldn't go back. You can argue with a government, debate laws, even protest policies, but once you fire on that government's army, once you force its soldiers to retreat in defeat, there's no pretending it didn't happen. The Rubicon had been crossed. The dice had been cast. War was no longer a possibility. It was a reality. In San Antonio, Colonel Ugartechea sent urgent dispatches to Mexico City. Rebellion had broken out. He needed reinforcements, supplies, orders. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. In Gonzales, the victorious settlers didn't go home. Instead, more men kept arriving, from Austin's colony, from the coastal settlements, from everywhere. They began to organize themselves into something resembling an army. They called it the Army of the People, a name that captured both its democratic spirit and its complete lack of formal military structure. They needed a commander, someone to lead them. On October 11th, they held a vote and elected Stephen F. Austin. the man who had brought the first American colonists to Texas, the cautious diplomat who had always advocated patience and negotiation with Mexico, Stephen F. Austin, who had spent months in a Mexican prison for his moderate views, now found himself at the head of an army marching toward war. His objective was simple to state, but dangerous to achieve. Take San Antonio de Bexar, the seat of Mexican military power in Texas, and drive General Martín Perfecto de Cos out of the province entirely. The army set out on October 13th, a column of about 300 men with no uniforms, no supply train, no military experience, just rifles, determination, and the memory of that foggy morning at Gonzales when 18 men had stood against 100 and won. The cannon they had fought for rode with them, mounted on its cotton wagon wheels, a symbol of defiance rolling toward the next battle. Thank you for watching the beginning of the Texas Revolution. Like and subscribe to stay tuned for the next major battles. What do you think about the early Texans banding together to fight for their liberty? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.